Cursor combined with Replit is the god mode for prototyping and early stage development. Having built countless number of prototypes in my past 10 years in tech startups, this is by far the strongest combo I've ever used. Want to find out how they're actually perfect companions for each other rather than the competitors that many people claim, and how this can scale to tens of thousands of users. I mean, we've all got that coming our way, right? Stay tuned to supercharge your development workflow and set yourself up for startup success. Let's dive in. First of all, what is Replit? Replit is this all-in-one development and deployment environment that allows people to easily collaborate and deploy code. Recent hype for Replit mostly came from the release of Replit agents, but their bread and butter is still the deployment and development environment setup. The environment is simple and doesn't have any extremely fancy features, but it's got everything you'll need to deploy an app from end to end. Let's dive into a repo I've created myself for a weekend project that I've been working on. So inside this interface, you'll see the standard editor on the left with the standard tabs and a whole bunch of the built-in AI features. But on the right, you see all of the common tools that you need with a database, in my case, a Postgres SQL, plus a simple key value database, should you want to use something simpler, object storage for storing larger files, say audio or videos or images in your case, plus a simple authentication framework that allows you to use Replit's own auth to protect your deployment, whether it's your development ones or your production ones, and also the whole tooling set for managing your deployments as well. Everything also just within one click. Plus, you also have the JavaScript debug console and the SSH, plus a bunch of the AI chat features that's already built in, but I won't go into too much details here. In Replit, getting your dev environment up and running is as simple as click on the run on top. So this starts the JS compiling that you've already set up and loads the web view directly on top. So now you have this fully fledged development environment set up and running within seconds. One of my favorite things with Replit is that the dev environment is set up with the external facing URL. So this URL that you see inside its web view, this can be shared externally, whether it's sharing your preview with your designer, other colleagues working on the same piece of code, or just sharing it with a customer behind closed doors. That's super convenient, right? Plus, if you're working on anything on mobile, you can open up this thing directly on mobile, and this will load the exact same website. Hot reloading is also enabled for this. Whenever you are making changes directly inside the code, it will also show up in your mobile interface. So this gives you a super rapid deployment workflow, especially when you're working closely with other people, or especially when you're working across different devices. On top of this, every repo has its own standalone development environment that you can use. So in this case, you can see my podcast editor is currently running on this 4 virtual CPU and 8 GB of RAM instance by itself. If you create new repos, that's another clean environment. So every time you have something new, it's always reproducible and easy to set up. You never have random dependencies causing issues with your setup because everything has the exact same template. Replit also provides a whole bunch of standard templates that you can use. This includes all of the popular frameworks. In most cases, I'm sure we'll be starting with the Next.js one. But having all of the other examples for other languages, they even have Bash example. I haven't dived into what it is yet, but I'm sure it's pure magic. So why choose Replit over the other deployment competitors like Vercel, Google Firebase, and even AWS Lambdas? To me, it wins out on its simplicity and its good enough pricing. I'll talk about that later in the video. Recently, there's been a lot of hype talking about Replit agents. The feature is actually super sick given how deep the integration is, because Replit controls your deployment environments as well as your dev environments. So the agent is actually able to deal with, code setup, file creation, environment setup, not just generating code files. It can even deploy and update your deployment as part of it for you. But the problem is, I think, given this advanced capabilities, Replit's team was only able to train this on Flask plus vanilla.js apps. But that's not the framework that most of us are using today. For me, I use Next.js quite heavily, so I couldn't really use the Replit agents directly for doing a lot of my prototyping work. I can see they are using this to target a lot of the non-coder community to allow people to build things from scratch when they don't care about the implementation underneath. This is great getting small toy projects off the ground. But if you're doing anything more advanced and require more tweaking, we'll just have to wait for Replit's team to integrate those additional frameworks before that becomes more useful to a wider set of developers. Just to give you an idea how Replit agent works, is you start by giving it a super simple prompt. It will give you a whole plan of the task it's intending to execute, and you can pick and choose the stuff that you wanted to do. It will go in to then generate the files, build the prototype, install the dependencies all for you. One thing that Replit has done really well is showcasing all of the steps it takes and going through each one of the files, the commands it generates, the command it even runs, the file it touches. Plus, given it has access to your dependencies, it can just install those dependencies directly for you, which is super slick. Something that Replit has built in that I love to see this getting into Cursor AI is every time it implements a functionality, it automatically creates a git commit just for you so that you can always have an easy roll back to the version that was previously working. Given that version control is a pretty well understood problem, having this built into the AI solution will make iteration much easier and gives you simple checkpoints to allow you to build one thing on top of another without worrying about a lot of the underlying details or the occasional accidental breakages. We can clearly see that Replit wants to be this framework for all, right? Being this all-encompassing IDE that deals with the environment as well as development process as well as deployment. However, it's still got a long way to go. In terms of customizability, it's definitely not on par with Cursor. And that's why combining Replit's strength inside deployment together with Cursor's AI features is by far the strongest combo that you can possibly get. Now the question is, how do we connect the two powerhouses together? It's quite clear that Replit really thought about the fact that people might want to use their custom third-party editors together with this cloud environments, so they build this directly into the interface. You can navigate to the SSH tab, and if you don't see it showing up, create a new tab and search for SSH. Click on it, you'll have access to the setting right here. You'll have a button to directly launch Cursor. This will create a new Cursor window and open up this remote workspace. But the coolest thing is, you have no local setup that's required. It connects directly to the cloud using the exact same environment, so there's no additional setup that's needed. All the code that you see here, say we add a new comment here, and then save the file, the change directly shows up in the Replit cloud interface as well, and vice versa. This just means that now, with your Cursor connected up to your Replit workspace, you have access to all of the awesome tools that you already have, whether it's Composer or inside your chat. Plus, the terminal is also connected up to the Replit dev environment so that you can deal with dependencies directly inside of Cursor as well. So you have full access to the full suite of services that is editing. Now you have the power of everything Cursor can do, but with the convenience of the full deployment of Replit. Now you've got your power environment set up. Now you can write new features, deploy at such rapid speed that you weren't able to before. Are we ready for production? Not quite so. And here's the time that we talk about some of Replit's limitations. First of all, Replit's deployment workflow isn't really designed to manage large-scale deployments. You can see that every deployment is just one click away. The issue is that you can so easily make mistakes and break the production environment. And by default, there's no way of enforcing any checks that happens before this deployment. So unlike GitHub Actions or other CI/CD frameworks that you might be using, there's no way to easily enforce additional tests to make sure that the deployment is going to work without affecting production customers. By default, they also don't have any environment isolations in databases, in object storage, so any places that you store data. The separate environment is not baked in by default, which means during development, it's easy for you to break data for your customers in prod unless you build in the functionalities to separate your development and production tables directly in code. Replit's environment doesn't create a separate database for this by default, neither do they for object storage, so you have to enforce that best practice on yourself. Given how much Replit abstracts away the underlying infra, plus providing the convenience of deployment, it's really fair for them to charge a premium on top of this. Based on my calculations, for databases, your server deployment, and object storage, ingress and egress data, this comes to around 10 to 30% of markup based on pricing comparisons to AWS and standard GCP pricing. This is probably fine during the development and prototyping phase, and given the effort it saves you, it's worth way more than the additional $20 or $30 that you're going to spend in those cases. But when you go into production, serving tens of thousands of users, the 20% can easily pile up very quickly. So that's the time we want to consider moving to a cloud provider directly to get the cheaper pricing rather than staying in Replit. This case also applies whether you are using Vercel, Firebase, or other cases. While these tools are great for prototyping and early stage development, but they are not the best thing to stay on for the production development, especially from a pricing perspective. And this is not to say Replit is actually doing a bad job by keeping the prices high, but That's not where their target is. Their target has always been to get you off the ground, to get your product running, get your product live as fast as possible. It was never to be the cheapest place for you to deploy and to run in the long term. Now that we understand the limitations, how do we prepare ourselves for that eventual migration to make it as painless as possible? Few things to look into. First, you want to wrap any of the Replit specific interfaces in your own coding interface such that you can choose different implementation underneath. So in my example, Replit has its own object storage SDK, but in my case, I've wrapped it in an object storage interface so that I can easily swap out the implementation underneath. I have a local one for just pure local testing, so I don't have to worry about wasting ingress and egress data. And the Replit storage one, mapping to this. I can imagine by the time when I need to migrate, I can just add in AWS S3 implementation for this. Without changing any of the code that leverages this interface, I can just swap out the implementation without any big refactors here. Funnily enough, I actually generated this interface using Cursor. I basically told Cursor, oh, hey, I want to make sure that I have an easy path migration out whenever I do need to change the implementation underneath, generate the code for me. And it did all of the changes for me directly. So another reason to connect the two tools up, right? For that maximum customizability plus long-term scalability. Replit has done a nice job where their Postgres connections doesn't require any additional setup. So you can use any of your standard Postgres libraries to make the connection. They just expose the environment to you via environment variables, so there's nothing you actually need to do there. The final thing is your package dependencies. Replit has kept things relatively simple inside just a .replit file and the replit.nix to outline the packages that's required within the containers. Here you can see the only two dependencies I've added is ffmpeg for dealing with a whole bunch of audio processing, plus the Postgres SQL for running the database instance. Once you've identified your dependencies, in the future when you deploy elsewhere, you'll also need to set up your own Docker images to include all of those dependencies. But setting that up is going to be relatively straightforward, and you're never locked into Replit itself. So all of these features are great, but it does come with one caveat. It does come at a price. Replit's price is relatively reasonable, especially if you pay on an annual basis. For the Replit core, you get the full remote machine that you can use and develop at any given time. You have that unlimited repos that you have. Plus, you get $10 of flexible credits towards your deployment. You can recoup most of the cost by using it in deployment. You might also say that $15 is still too much for me. I don't really want to spend that money. Depending on the features that you want to get out of Replit, and there are alternative solutions out there. Say, if you just want the exposed development environments, you can use a tool called ngrok. It basically serves as a reverse proxy that exposes one of your local ports to the public internet so that you can do the same kind of website and prototype sharing that I previously showed. If you prefer having databases all managed for you without having to do any deployments, Google Firebase might be another good solution. The same for Vercel there. But the problem I have with those two platforms is they do have a very prescribed way of doing deployments, and their configuration is quite a bit more complex than that of Replit's. Be careful with potential vendor lock-in there, and make sure that you apply the best practices I just mentioned by applying interfaces on top to make sure that you have the full flexibility in the long term. Now that you have all of the knowledge on how to streamline your development and deployment workflow, I'm sure you want to find out how you can dive deeper into Cursor's AI features to maximize your productivity there. Check out that video for my pro tips there. In the meantime, happy shipping, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.